Hello, chess fans. In today's video I am going to share 3 games where I played the Goring Gambit. Game 1 starts with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4. E takes d4. c3. D takes c3, bishop to c4, c takes b2. The bishop recaptures the pawn. My opponent develops the bishop to b4, delivering check. I move my knight from b to d2 to block the check. Knight to f6. I advance d5, putting pressure on the knight. In response, my opponent pushed d5, counterattacking my bishop. I took the knight, and my opponent responded by capturing my bishop. Then, I captured the pawn on g7, attacking the rook. The rook moved to g8. Short castle. My opponent pushed c3, forking my knight and bishop. I moved my rook to e1, delivering check. My opponent blocked with their knight. Then, I slid my queen to a4, checking again and attacking the bishop. We exchanged bishops. My queen captures the pawn on b2. My opponent develops the bishop to e6. Rook a to d1. Queen slides to c7. I advance my knight to e4. My opponent moved their knight to d5. I jumped my knight to f6, delivering check. We traded knights. My opponent moved their queen to e7, offering a queen exchange. I then moved my queen to h6. f6. In this position, I missed a forced checkmate. Can you find it? It's queen to h5, delivering check. The bishop blocks the check. I capture the queen with my rook, delivering another check. The king takes the rook. My queen slides to c5 for another check. The king moves to e6. I play knight to h4. The bishop moves to create space for the king. Then, my queen moves to d6, delivering yet another check. The king is forced to f7, and finally, queen to d7 delivers checkmate. Back to the game. I advance my knight to d4. The king hides on f7. I captured the bishop on e6. My opponent played rook from a to e8. I moved my queen to h5, delivering checkmate. Game 2 starts with e4, e5, knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, e takes d4, c3, d takes c3, bishop to c4, bishop to c5. I captured the pawn on f7, delivering check. The king moved to f8. I retreated my bishop to b3. My opponent then moved their queen to f6. I captured the pawn on c3 with my knight. Bishop to b4. Short castle. We traded pieces. Knight to e5. We exchanged knights. I moved my queen to f3. My opponent developed the knight to f6. I developed my bishop to a3. d6. Rook f to e1. Bishop to e6. Rook a to d1. King to e7. Queen to d3. Rook h to f8. We exchanged bishops. e5. The queen takes the pawn on a2. I capture the knight with my pawn. The king captures my pawn. I move my queen to f3, putting the king in check. It moves to g6. I shift my queen to g4, delivering another check. The king slides to h6. I move my bishop to c1, checking again. My opponent pushes g5 to block the check. I capture the pawn on g5 with my queen, delivering checkmate. Game 3 starts with e4. e5. Knight to f3. Knight to c6. d4. E takes d4. c3. D takes c3. Bishop to c4. C takes b2. The bishop recaptures the pawn. d6. Short castle. h6. e5. D takes e5. Queen to b3. Queen to e7. Rook to e1. My opponent moves the queen to b4, proposing a queen exchange. I capture the pawn on f7 with my bishop, putting the king in check. The king moves to d8. I take the knight on g8. And we exchange queens. My opponent develops the bishop to d6. I move my knight to c3. The rook shifts to e8. I transfer my rook from a1 to d1. The king moves to e7. I advance my knight to b5. a6. I capture the pawn on e5 with my knight. My opponent takes my knight with their knight. I then capture the bishop with my knight. My opponent responds by taking my knight with a pawn. I move my bishop to a3. The king shifts to f6. I capture the pawn on d6 with my rook. My opponent develops their bishop to e6. We exchange bishops and trade rooks. I move my bishop to b2, attacking the knight. The king moves to f7. I capture the knight with my bishop. We push our pawns. We exchange rooks. I advance my g-pawn. Time running out, I pre-move. I push my a-pawn and promote it to a queen. I deliver checkmate with my king and queen. Thank you so much for watching. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget to subscribe and tap that notification bell so you can stay updated with all our latest content.